Alright guys, welcome back to part 4 of the NASCAR Iceberg. We're finally finishing off this iceberg, and that'll be that. Well, actually kvapilnation updated the iceberg, so we're gonna have to make a part 5 later on to try and get all of those topics. Anyways, for right now, just make sure you check out the other parts if you haven't already, and make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss any of my videos. We're going to pick up right where we left off, halfway through Tier 6. Carl Edwards was actually not in the 2007 edition of NASCAR Games, reportedly because he and EA could not agree on a contract. Clint Bowyer is also not in the game in the Cup Series, but he appears in the Busch Series. This is due to his car number 07 and his sponsor Jack Daniels. Ken Schrader also does not appear in the game because of his sponsorship agreement with Little Debbie that stated that the brand could only be promoted during Cup Series events. Base Speedway has a complex history, but it was able to host a race at NASCAR's top level in 1951. However, afterwards the track seemingly vanished. The track had such a short and seemingly insignificant history that people literally forgot about it. Very few photos exist of the track, and many sources reference the track as Greenville-Pickens Speedway because the tracks looked identical. Over time, the track has been abandoned, succumbed to nature, and built over with 3 buildings on it. Most people familiar with NASCAR gaming remember NASCAR the Game Inside Line as the 2013 edition of NASCAR Gaming. However, Eutechnyx also released NASCAR 2013 The Game for PC. This version, compared to the console version launched earlier in the year, had the new Gen 6 cars with optimization here and there. This was the first time an officially licensed NASCAR game was released on PC since 2005. Russell Phillips was a new driver in the NASCAR Limited Sportsman division who in his 15th start got his first career pole at Charlotte. After just 17 laps into the race, tragedy struck as his car was launched into the air and went roof first into the catch fence. Phillips unfortunately passed away. After this, the Sportsman division never returned to Charlotte following the 3rd death in 6 years. A roof reinforcement bar was not installed in race cars until the next year. This was after Dale Earnhardt had a crash where he was injured at Talladega, and it was called the Earnhardt bar. It is so unfortunate that NASCAR waited until a star got injured to do something about safety, but tried to ignore tragic deaths of seemingly average drivers, especially in the lower series. Jeff Gordon was entering his last couple races as a full-time driver in 2015 when he arrived at Jeff Gordon Raceway. Wait, what? Well, Phoenix International Raceway temporarily changed the track name to Jeff Gordon Raceway in honor of Jeff Gordon for the final race before the championship race. Between 1968 and 1971, NASCAR promoted Grand American cars in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series for what were known as pony cars. These were extra manufacturers that were allowed to compete in select races with the traditional manufacturers to fill the field. Low car counts at certain races resulted in the addition of these manufacturers. Controversy came at Bowman Gray Stadium in 1971 whenever Bobby Allison won in a Mustang, one of the before-mentioned pony cars. However, NASCAR did not count this win in his overall win total. This is very strange considering that NASCAR did not say before the race that wins in pony cars would not count. It's even more confusing whenever you consider that other drivers that won in pony cars were credited with the race wins. And what absolutely blows my mind is that NASCAR has a record book with him having 10 race wins in 1971 in one section, and in another section of the same exact record book, it states that he has 11 wins in 1971. I don't think even NASCAR knew what they were doing. An annual tradition began in the Truck Series back in 2013 called the Mudsummer Classic at Eldora. However, the MLB wasn't happy about this, as the name was obviously a sort of parody of their Midsummer Classic. In 2015, there was a space added in between Mud and Summer, but that did not satisfy the MLB. The two parties came to a settlement, and beginning in 2016, it would be called the Eldora Dirt Derby. Candace Muzny was a former NASCAR driver in the NASCAR K&N Pro Series and late model divisions. The world was shocked when she was found dead at her home in Oklahoma in February of 2020. This was a month after she was arrested for holding a knife to a worker's throat at a nail salon for speaking a different language than English. That's, not okay. The cause of death was eventually cited as accidental drowning. This is honestly my biggest fear. Back in 2016, Mike Wallace took his daughter to a Rascal Flatts concert. While leaving the venue, Wallace was talking to a group of 3 men when one, out of nowhere, punched him and knocked him out. After falling to the ground, the men continued to beat on him. Mike's daughter tried to intervene, but was also injured in the process. Mike Wallace ended up with 12 stitches in his lip, a black eye, and multiple teeth knocked out. They went to court, and after the first mistrial, the charges were dropped at the request of the Wallace family. Some reasoning behind this can be inferred, as defense attorneys accused Wallace of instigating the fight and citing that he was drunk and on drugs at the time of the incident. NASCAR actually had a convertible division for 4 seasons from 1956 to 1959. Curtis Turner won 22 races in the first season, but lost out to Bob Wellborn in the championship. Bob would go on to win the first 3 championships. Turner would never win a championship in the series, but would be the all-time wins leader in the series with 38 in just 79 starts. So what happened to Dale Earnhardt's death car? Nobody knows. Well, okay, somebody has to know, right? There are many rumors that have circulated, but if anybody knows for sure, it's Richard Childress. Some people speculate that Childress destroyed the car, and others say that it's buried in his Montana ranch. It could be possible that he just took the good parts out of the car and kept them for future use. Billy Crump was a trusted employee for Rick Hendrick. He acquired many car dealerships and was quickly becoming wealthy and famous before entering into the NASCAR scene. Billy even became the man in charge for Hendrick's sportwear company, growing it from a $600,000 valuation to over $20 million. Crump left Hendrick Sportswear after it was sold to Ken Barbie. Crump then started a new sportswear company with contracts with NASCAR's biggest stars like Earnhardt. Everything was going good until he was tragically murdered in 1992. It's weird because the murderers didn't take any of Billy's jewelry, his money, or his gold BMW. It is rumored that somebody hired a hitman to kill him, and yeah, it does make sense because they didn't take anything. So I'm going to step back and say that I am not going to accuse anybody of hiring a hitman, especially since the police obviously investigated this and the case is still unsolved. However, a small corner of Reddit believes it was Rick Hendrick because Crump was supposedly going to report him for tax evasion, but neither of these claims are proven true. Others believe it was the person who bought Hendrick Sportswear, Ken Barbie, because he expected Crump to stay with the company. Or it could have been literally anybody, but these two are who some fans like to point out. Kevin Grubb was a NASCAR driver in the late 90s and early 2000s. He primarily raced in the Busch Series with some pretty average teams. Although he never won a race, he collected 32 top 10s in 174 starts. However, in 2004, Grubb failed a drug test. He was later reinstated just 2 years later in June of 2006 by NASCAR. He raced 4 Busch Series races that year before he had his eyes on the next race at Richmond. At Richmond, he crashed on lap 2, and NASCAR decided to drug test him. Grubb denied the test, and by NASCAR rules, refusing a drug test is an automatic failure of one. As a result, Grubb was indefinitely suspended by NASCAR. The very next day, Grubb stated that he refused the test because of injuries suffered in the crash, specifically a concussion, and that he didn't have any recollection of NASCAR telling him to take one. He said that he would happily take it right then, but NASCAR didn't budge, refusing to do anything about Grubb's situation. 3 years later, in May of 2009, Grubb was found dead in a hotel in the Richmond, Virginia area. It was determined that the cause of death was suicide. Dinner with Racers is a podcast that brings on many drivers and simply has a conversation with them. Jeremy Mayfield appeared on the show over 4 years ago. During this interview, Jeremy said that Dale Earnhardt told him to, quote, save his money because Brian France is going to take over the sport and ruin it. Even before he took over, drivers saw how bad he would be for the sport. Continuing with Jeremy Mayfield, NASCAR faking his drug test has been a very popular topic. This is because he appeared on the Dale Jr. download just in the last month. So I'm going to go at it from Jeremy's perspective. NASCAR had little to no idea what they were doing with the drug tests. They did not know what drugs were being tested or what were even legal. In one drivers' meeting, Carl Edwards stood up and asked if the drivers could even take the over-the-counter medications on their cars, and NASCAR did not have a clear answer. Further, drugs were a hot topic of conversation in sports at the time, so NASCAR kind of jumped on the hype train and started randomly testing their drivers. Jeremy Mayfield failed a drug test, but they could not tell him what he was taking. According to Jeremy, he let NASCAR know that he was on Adderall before the season started and they were fine with it. He thought this is what made him test positive. Also, there was apparently a time when NASCAR did a follow-up test and Jeremy did a personal test just 20 minutes after, and he tested positive on NASCAR's test and negative on his own personal test. This leads to a lot of people to speculate that NASCAR had it out for Jeremy, doubled down on their initial mistake, or tried to make it a PR stunt to show NASCAR, compared with other sports, was also weeding out people on drugs. Overall, it was a messy situation where NASCAR indefinitely suspended Mayfield, who was a very vocal driver and not on good terms with NASCAR, and they really did not try to understand his situation or give him the benefit of the doubt. Jeremy could have easily said he was on drugs and did NASCAR's Road to Recovery program, but denied it to protect his own personal image. So this is the final tier. I've learned so much about the sport and the things we've covered this far, but this takes it up another notch. Also, quick disclaimer. We are getting into a lot of conspiracies, so those will simply be for entertainment purposes. I'm in no way saying that they are real or not, they are just for you to hear and to enjoy. I will sometimes be presenting conspiracies from the side of a minority of people. I know you guys have been waiting for this, and I've been excited to dig really deep into this stuff, so let's get right into it. The late Bruton Smith proposed an idea in the mid-90s that NASCAR's Winston Cup Series should form multiple leagues or conferences, something like an East and West division. This would be like the ARCA East and West Series. For context, NASCAR was a very established nationally broadcasted series in the 90s and had gotten away from its grassroots short track era from decades earlier. It wasn't uncommon for NASCAR to have 45 or so races a year in the early 70s. If NASCAR wanted to have more races, then a way to do this would be to have 2 races every Sunday, one for East Coast fans and one for West Coast. This idea was stalled until 2003. As very well documented, NASCAR was rising in popularity in the early 2000s. The schedule had just been expanded to 36 races a few years prior, and they wanted more. So for these reasons, the idea to have the 2 leagues was once again revisited. In February of 2003, Bill France rejected the idea and said it was unworkable. In late 2019, Twitter user Drunken Brian France stated that Kyle Busch was having a thing with one of the Monster Girls and that he and his wife, Samantha, was going to get a divorce. Obviously, this was fake. The story was coming from a parody account. This did start a lot of rumors, and it was a big story within the NASCAR community at the time, and many people actually believed it. Rick Hendrick was diagnosed with leukemia in 1996. 95% of the people his age with a similar diagnosis died within 2 years of the diagnosis. As Rick Hendrick is still with us, he definitely beat the odds. Well, at this time, Hendrick was facing some legal trouble. Like, major trouble. He was facing life in prison and millions in fines for mail fraud. With this, in hindsight, timely and fortunately non-fatal condition, everyone, including the prosecutor, was calling for his mercy. After it was all said and done, Hendrick was fined $250,000, ordered to stay home for a year, and to stay away from his car dealerships and race team for a year. With his political connections, in 2000, President Bill Clinton granted a pardon for Rick Hendrick. At this time, Hendrick's leukemia was in full remission. Actually, just 2 years after his diagnosis, doctors told him he no longer needed chemotherapy back in 1998. So this is why some people point to this and say, hey, he faked leukemia to get out of prison. The fact that there are such slim odds of survival, some people think there is no way possible he could have been one of the lucky 5%. So I'm going to defend Rick here. The major thing is the fact that of all the people who survived, Rick Hendrick was one of them. This is in no way proof that he faked it. It's kind of like this philosophy, just in a more extreme case. Although someone wins the lottery every single time, the chances of it happening to one person specifically are very, very slim. But just because that specific person won it, doesn't mean that there was foul play at hand, even with the chances being so low. Also, if you're questioning the fact that he got a pardon by President Bill Clinton, then check out the articles in the description below. In Donald Trump's final day of office, Rick Hendrick's nephew was actually granted a pardon as well. During the spring Texas race in 2013, a man in the infield shot himself in the head. Apparently, this was after he got into an argument with other campers near him. Police also note that alcohol may have been a factor. Several people unfortunately witnessed the accident, which just makes my stomach get into a knot. What a horrible situation for all the people involved. Angela Harkness, or her real name, is a former stripper and NASCAR team owner. Of all the schemes in her life, Angela's Motorsports in 2003 was her biggest one. She came into the sport with the claim of being a kindergarten teacher, trophy girl, motocross champion, among other things. Angela partnered up with Gary D. Jones, a vice president of a Wells Fargo branch. Jones was married, then moved in with Angela, and the two committed fraud together. They made a Busch Series start with driver Jay Sauter in 2002, but had their minds on 2003 for a full-time Cup Series gig, and were even buying cars from Robert Yates. Before the season started, they needed $6 million to fund the team. Their checks began to bounce, then Angela threatened their sponsor, WiredFlyer.com, to pay $350,000 or to face legal action. The team quickly dissolved, with many investors losing money. It came out that Angela and Jones had embezzled more than $1 million from Wells Fargo, and that is how they got the money to start the team. In 2004, they were convicted of many crimes, but Angela fled to Mexico before her jail sentence. She then took a nice plane ride to the Middle East and was on the run until she was caught in 2007. Donald Trump has attended 2 NASCAR races, the 2001 Daytona 500 and the 2020 Daytona 500. In the 2001 race, obviously, Dale Earnhardt died in a wreck. In the 2020 running of the race, Ryan Newman had one of the scariest wrecks in NASCAR history and was injured. So the Donald Trump curse just refers to the fact that every time he has shown up to the track, something really bad has happened. There was a rumor that Dale Earnhardt Jr. was on painkillers in the late 2000s and early 2010s. There are no reliable sources that have confirmed this. Anyways, some people use this to explain his rough career winless stretch and bad performances from 2008 to 2012. NASCAR actually had their own, albeit short-lived, open wheel league. This was called the NASCAR Speedway Division in the years 1952 and 1953. The car looked like a hybrid of Indy cars and sprint cars at the time and had a stock engine. The championship consisted of only 5 races in the first season. They raced at tracks like Darlington and Martinsville. The division never really gained any interest from spectators or racers, as just after 4 races in 1953, the series collapsed. Only 19 different drivers competed in the 4 races, and spectators were not showing up to the track. It's obvious NASCAR was trying to be a monopoly in motorsports. I mean, they tried to build an open wheel car, the Convertible series, the left-right series, and they tried street racing, oval racing, and dirt racing across all of them. NASCAR raced anything and everything that was working for other forms of motorsports and more, but could never go all in on these experimental series. Imagine what the motorsports world would look like today if NASCAR held on to all of these. There is a rumor that came from an escort that said Denny Hamlin made her do some things. I'm not going to say it because I don't want to get demonetized, but most people think that this was a random girl on Twitter trying to get clout, but it could have happened. Anyways, this was a few years ago. There was also a rumor just last year that Denny Hamlin was sleeping with other escorts. His long-term partner went on Twitter and stated that her and her children deserve better, he hasn't changed, and basically exposed him. She never said why, and although the message was clear, the motives were ambiguous. Hamlin has never addressed these tweets or rumors, or even the status of his relationship since. In May of 2000, a pedestrian walkway collapsed over a 4-lane highway at Charlotte Motor Speedway at about the same time that Dale Earnhardt Jr. was crossing the finish line to win the Winston. Over 100 race fans were injured, and 16 were critically injured. As always, I never show graphic photos or videos in my videos out of respect for all involved. But to kind of visualize it, it was a massive walkway that was built for the sole purpose of getting fans in and out of the track faster. The walkway collapsed more or less in the middle of the bridge. It made sort of a funnel or a V shape, and people slid down the banking on top of each other. It was a really graphic scene. Tragically, many people felt the effects of their injuries for years to come, and one man reportedly succumbed to injuries and passed away. This is heartbreaking. Many families settled in a lawsuit as a result. Mr. Beast was going to sponsor Josh Ryum's truck at Las Vegas Motor Speedway in 2019. On the entry list, the sponsor just said Mr. Beast, so it's not clear exactly what the truck would have looked like. This was at the time of the T-Series versus PewDiePie saga, so we could assume the scheme would have had something to do with subscribing to PewDiePie. Anyways, Jimmy backed out of the deal last second apparently, and the truck never ran. He has released some NASCAR-themed merch, but has not made an appearance in the scene since. According to legend, Talladega Superspeedway was built over a Native American burial ground. If you've ever heard of the Talladega Curse, this is the root reason it is supposedly cursed or haunted. Another popular legend is that in the valley that the track is in, a Native American tribe had a horse racing track. A chief was thrown off his horse and died, and haunts the grounds to this day. The last legend is that when Andrew Jackson seized the land from the local Creek tribe, a shaman cursed the land. One person that would probably believe in this whole ghost theory thing is Bobby Isaac. In 1973, Bobby was leading the race at Talladega when he heard voices telling him to get out of the car immediately. He pulled into the pits and refused to finish the race. Allegedly, Buffy Waltrip, Michael Waltrip's former wife, had an affair with Jarrett. This happened in 2008 when Jarrett was racing for Michael Waltrip Racing. Jarrett and his wife separated after the allegations, however they reportedly are on decent terms. Buffy and Michael separated, and according to Michael, this is because of his inability to cope with Dale Earnhardt's death. The allegations were never confirmed by anyone. Also, information for this was really hard to find. Nobody really came out and denied or confirmed the rumors, and I can't find the original source of them. They're just kind of there with no proof or much information at all. 2 men around 50 years old died of carbon monoxide poisoning in November of 2018 in the infield of Texas Motor Speedway. This was because of a gasoline generator. The 2 men built a custom bus and did not have the proper ventilation necessary to release the fumes. So we touched on all kinds of crazy NASCAR series before, but none are as outlandish as this. In November of 2021, there were reports of a NASCAR meeting with Airspeeder to discuss the potential of a flying cars series. The reports said that a formal partnership could be announced as soon as 2022. Ben Kennedy, NASCAR's Senior Vice President of Racing Development and Strategy, endorsed the idea and said that it was a possibility. This was in the midst of NASCAR laying out a 10-year plan of the sport from 2021 until 2031. So what exactly is Airspeeder? It is a racing series that consists of flying cars. The cars currently do not have pilots, but are remotely controlled. The idea is for drivers to actually pilot the machines and simply race them. Nothing much has come out since, but if you still aren't convinced that this was a real conversation, look at this tweet from Airspeeder. This all being said, nothing is confirmed yet, and not much news has come out. Airspeeder plans to have manned flying cars tested in 2021, but that never happened, and they are now aiming for later in 2022. Team Keller Racing was very briefly a NASCAR team. The team entered the 2020 O'Reilly Auto Parts 400, the only entry for the team ever, but were left out of the race. This was in the midst of COVID, so there was no qualifying. With a car limit of 40 cars per week, and 41 entries at Texas, the team with the fewest owners' points was dropped from the race. And with a total of 0 points, Team Keller Racing never had a chance. Since they were never going to race at Texas, the driver was never announced for the race, and neither was the sponsor. However, Tommy Baldwin Jr. was announced as the crew chief of this mysterious number 90 car. The team never entered another race again. If you go to their website, teamkellerracing.com, it simply says coming soon at the top. The rest of the page is also unfinished, as it looks like somebody added links to different things, but did not bother altering the demo text. However, there is an archive located on the page labeled June 2020. This was the month before the Texas race, but ultimately it's just demo text as well. It's like after Texas, the team completely vanished. After the death of Dale Earnhardt, many newspapers immediately requested access to Earnhardt's autopsy photos. The Earnhardt family, led by Teresa Earnhardt, were opposed and did not want to share the photos. This led to a legal battle, to which it resulted in the newspapers ultimately not getting them. This was dubbed the Earnhardt exemption. Florida passed a law to exempt autopsy photos and videos from open records laws. Autopsy photos, videos, and audio recordings are made available only to family members unless under court order. This came up recently with the tragic passing of Bob Saget, where people were scrambling for his autopsy photos. However, the story gets deeper whenever it came out that a fan allegedly had autopsy photos of Dell. Doctors claimed that the photos were fake, but it became this underground market for sharing these pictures. Josh Rayum was suspended by NASCAR in November of 2020 for drawing a swastika on a toaster strudel and posting it on Twitter. Josh immediately apologized, but it really did not help. Having said that, he was reinstated by NASCAR about 5 months later. I mean, how stupid do you have to be? The Laurel Hill Tunnel in northern Pennsylvania has an interesting history. It was along the route of an initially failed railroad in the 1800s and abandoned. It was repurposed as a part of a highway in the 1940s and abandoned once again about 2 decades later. The interesting thing from this tunnel comes from this single picture: a stack of racing tires found outside of the tunnel. Further, a huge metal compartment had been built onto the tunnel in the mid-2000s, with alleged tire barriers and runoff areas right outside of the tunnel. A group of hikers heard V8 engines and saw Sunoco racing fuel outside of it. This led many to speculate NASCAR cars were being tested inside of the tunnel, but that's all anybody knew for sure. Reports came out that it was actually Chip Ganassi testing his race cars inside. A tunnel is a great environment to gain information, with no wind, and you can easily control the temperatures inside. The tunnel is less than a mile long, so it is assumed that it was more of aerodynamic testing rather than top speed. In 2014, former IndyCar driver Darren Manning stated that not only did he test an IndyCar for Chip in the tunnel, he also crashed in one. The first testing, according to multiple sources, was in 2004 with Chip Ganassi's IndyCar team. It is thought that NASCAR testing started a couple of years later. As further evidence, in 2006, Chip was awarded a patent on the idea. It appears that this is all common knowledge for the locals, but the story has not yet reached the ears of many outside of this small bubble. Canadian Motor Speedway was a proposed track that would be a 3/4 of a mile oval and a 2-mile road course. The speedway would be built in Ontario, just 4 miles away from the Canada-US border, right outside of Buffalo, New York. The design team for the racetrack, well, we can actually say complex because it was going to be more than just a track, was led by none other than Jeff Gordon. Investments in the complex started way back in 2007, but with any big construction project, it would be years before any of the construction would even start. 6 years later in 2013, development began on Miller Creek, a big environmental reconstruction. At this point, the racetrack should have been built by 2017. However, failed land purchases up until 2016 delayed the project. In 2017, the project was delisted from the stock exchange as the $700 million project stock was practically worthless, losing investors all kinds of money. Since we're on financials, the biggest investment came from a Kuwait-based investor. It wasn't until 2020 when the project director admitted the funding from Kuwait was gone. The local government also opposed the idea of the track because changes to the road infrastructure had to be made to support it, and many wanted to use the land for agricultural purposes. After many more setbacks and delays, the final date for the project to start construction was in November of 2021. This is when the zoning waiver expired. Leading up to this date, the project leaders seemed to kind of give up as they did not even try to purchase the land they still needed. The waiver expired, and that was the end of the project entirely. This would have been so big for NASCAR. Imagine, they could have tapped into the Canadian and New York markets big time. EA made NASCAR games until NASCAR 09, but initially planned to have a 2010 edition of the game. Basically, due to budget cuts, a lack of sales from the 2009 game, and their license expiring, the game was scrapped. However, Ross D.P. Harris on Twitter showed some photos of unreleased renderings of tracks on the game, which are pretty cool. Now, this is probably the wildest story and perfect end to this iceberg. Although Brian Vickers' wife has been talked about a lot in the past years, if you haven't heard about it, then buckle up. Sarah Kellen, wife of former NASCAR driver Brian Vickers, was exposed for being the, quote, lieutenant recruiter of female slaves for Jeffrey Epstein. She was one of Jeffrey's personal assistants. She was also mentioned right around 350 times in Jeffrey's flight logs that were exposed. Also listed in the logs are these names that any motorsport fan can recognize. Although their relationship with Epstein is unknown, it is evident that Sarah was one of the top people in the whole disgusting circus. To give Sarah a voice, she claims she was made out to be a monster, and she was a victim as well, with bad things also happening to her. So guys, that does it. This has been an incredible journey, and thank you for all of the support on the series. You guys have been great for watching, and shout out to the people in the comments for adding more context or information to the stories. I set out with the goal of making this a community project, and it has definitely turned out to be one. With that being said, I will make another part going over the additions kvapilnation has made to the iceberg, and I hope you guys tune in for that as well. That might be a little bit down the road because this project has taken... I kind of need to take a step back and relax for a minute before I dive into another part. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.